and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good. Thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. It's been a crazy week, but we're diving into tax time. So closing the books on last year and getting ready for 2022 and all that it brings.
Yeah, obviously same here. It is the season, right? So we're all doing that. And I think too, it's a nice, even though people are like, oh, taxes, I think it's a good time too to look back at the metrics and look back at the year. I think it's easy to just assume that everything's going fine and not really look at it. But I think it's helpful to go back, look at the numbers, look at the metrics, and just make sure that things are really going well, or if it's time to adjust strategy.
Yeah, and I always feel like I'm able to catch things that I did last year in terms of how I kept books or how I evaluated properties that I can change and make better for next year. And so this is a great time, especially tax season. When I have to get all these documents together anyway, it just feels like this is the time to do it. And again, it helps me look at things like repairs, cash on cash return from last year, return on investment. Because again, we always estimate these things. We talk so much about the property analysis, but we don't often look backward and see if we were right. We just kind of let the investment ride because we can't do much with it after the fact. So all those things are super important when trying to identify how the last year went.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes it ends up looking better than the pro forma, and sometimes it doesn't look anywhere near as good as Excel made you think it would, right? So
exactly.
For me, what I find too is that first year always seems like the worst year, because there's always those things that as soon as the tenant moves in, they catch a few things that were missed along the way, which I don't think is unexpected. I don't mean for that to come across as bad contractors or anything like that. No, I love the contractors we work with. I think that even new builds though, oftentimes new builders will have a period at which, 7 days, 30 days, whatever, make a list and we'll come out and fix things. Because when it's a whole house worth of stuff and no one's living in it, there's just things here and there that just inherently get missed. So anyway, there always ends up being those kind of first month issues. And I know you've had some of that lately, right? And some of the things you brought on lately.
Yeah, we just, the house that we just got on the market after months and rehab and all this prep work and okay, we did the punch list 3 different times and we were ready to go. And the tenants found 3 things in the first day that needed to be fixed. And it's just how it goes. It's just part of, like you said, knocking the rust off of a property that no one's lived in and actually starting to live in it. And that's fine. But it's those kinds of expenses that we don't really talk about enough. And so I want to make sure that we're considering them.
Yeah, and that's really what we want to get into today is there are just expenses that are associated with rental properties and with owning real estate where these expenses are just often overlooked or often forgotten. And so we wanted to do a deep dive today on that topic. So for those that have been listening for a while, when we say deep dive, where we're going. But if you haven't, we focus on this podcast on inspiration and education about real estate investing. That's what we say every time in the intro, and we mean it. Today we want to do a little more on the education side to make sure that these are things that are not missed, because it's really easy if you're doing your math wrong to make a house look like, oh, this is going to be an amazing investment if you leave off some of those expenses. So we wanted to get in here and talk about some of the realities of some of these often overlooked expenses.
Yeah, and I often experience this when I talk to other investors, or especially when I'm in other investing groups online, where people will say, "Oh, the return on the investment in this one was 25%," but it's amazing how many expenses they're actually ignoring when they're doing that. To really understand our properties and really understand what we're doing, these are the kind of things that you can't ignore. And so it's important for us to talk about them, to bring them top of mind, so that you can consider them when you're looking at these things.
Yeah. And so again, that's kind of the purpose of a deep dive, that these things don't often come up in an interview with a guest because we're oftentimes moving really quickly through several deals and several stories. And we don't do a real comprehensive look at some of these expenses. So to get real with some of the expenses, let's look at 7 commonly overlooked expenses. So I'll run through the list and then we'll jump in. So the first one that we'll talk about is tenant turnover costs. Second one being seasonal demand for purchase and rent and how that can fluctuate seasonally. Third would be local regulatory or zoning considerations. Fourth would be adjustable rate or balloon loans and different loan considerations. Fifth would be repair contingency in the rehab project, particularly with labor and material costs going up recently. Six would be shifting market conditions, and seven would be property taxes changing after purchase.
Awesome. Well, David, why don't you kick us off then with tenant turnover?
Yeah, tenant turnover. One of the things, if you work on any sort of Excel sheet or any kind of calculator or rental breakdown, there's always this line in the analysis for vacancy, because we know that at some point a property is not going to be fully occupied all the time in perpetuity for the next 30 years. I mean, who knows? That may happen, but that would be a very unlikely scenario if you have a tenant that moves in and stays for 30 years, right? There's probably going to be vacancy. And so with that tenant turnover comes expenses. Oftentimes when you see vacancy, I've heard people talk about putting, as low as 2 or 3% of the rent aside for vacancy. I've heard more of 5 or 10, or I've heard the round number of 1/12, like take 1 month's rent and use that as a rule of thumb. So different rules of thumb are out there, but to understand what that percentage means, the kind of costs that I think about when it comes to tenant turnover would be, one, the property manager fees to place a tenant, which is generally somewhere between a half a month to a month rent. The property manager will charge that as just all the fees associated with marketing the property, taking applications, doing open houses and tours and processing all of that. That is a bunch of work. And so they quite appropriately get a fee for that. There's going to be time where the property is vacant, where those showings are going on, where any kind of cleaning or repairs are made between tenants. So there's actual time when you are not collecting rents. There's then the costs associated with some of that, whether that's a carpet cleaner or someone just to clean in general. Maybe at the point of tenant turnover or the point where you walk in and realize like that fridge is 20 years old and maybe we need to replace it. Maybe you're replacing appliances, or maybe you're painting, or whatever that may be, other updates that you do. There may be repairs that fall into that. And then in the unfortunate situation that it's more like an eviction, there could be costs and delays there as well. So Nate, what am I missing off that list?
No, I think you've hit up all the big stuff. I think what I would say here is that there are ways to mitigate some of these things, right? Can you do showings while the tenants are still in? Are there repairs that you can get taken care of right as that person's moving out, and scheduling things in advance? And there are ways to make this much worse, right? If you go, well, I'll figure it out when they're gone. It's a hassle for me to deal with it now. I'll just tackle it later. You're going to delay your problems and you're going to make that turnover slower. So, looking at this, knowing it's a problem is great, but start to learn how you can mitigate that problem so that you don't have these extra fees going in next time around.
Yeah, we have a property where I was super pleased with the property manager. The tenant moved out towards the end of the week, and the property manager scheduled a painter for the weekend, came in and repainted over the weekend, had already done showings, and someone moved in early that following week. It was vacant for I could count on one hand the number of days. It was amazing how little vacancy, how quick the painting happened. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. With a lot of intentionality and strategy, you can tighten that up. But yeah, there's also some unexpected, unfortunate things. I know you had an eviction recently, and yeah, those can be painful and expensive as well.
That's just part of the game, unfortunately.
Yep. So calculating that in. So then second on the list is the seasonal demand. So Nate, as a realtor, talk to us about seasonal demand and what that means.
Yeah, and this depends on where you're located, right? So those of us, David and I up here in the north, winter is a bad time to buy or sell a home. It's a bad time to rent a home. Nobody wants to get the moving truck out when there's 6 inches of snow on the ground, right? In other areas of the country, same idea, right? If you're in Arizona, July is not my favorite time to be moving. I don't want to be moving a bunch of stuff when it's 115 degrees outside. So know that your different areas are going to have different seasonalities. Again, I'm more familiar with the northern states. So for us, winter is going to be a lower rent rate, right? If I'm buying a property in November and it's going to take me a month to rehab it, it's a really bad time to list a rental in, end of December, beginning of January. It just is. And so I'm probably going to bring in a lower rent rate, and as a result, going to have a lower income. So know that there are seasonal differences. If you're looking at rent rates in one time period, but not going to be renting that property to another time period, it might be totally different numbers based on how that plays out.
Yeah, some of that can also fall with just the school year, where people may not want to move kids in the middle of a school year and things like that. So I know the summer could be a busy month anyway, depending on the demographic and type of tenant that you attract based on that property. So all of that can flux throughout time as well.
All right, David, let's jump to number 3 then. What about local regulatory or zoning considerations?
Yeah, one of the things that I immediately think of from like a regulatory or zoning standpoint is there are communities out there that require an inspection for a rental, and whether that rental gets certified or on some sort of master list somewhere, something like that, where an inspector has to come in and make sure that it's up to code compliance enough to be rented out. So converting a house that's been lived in owner occupant to a rental property may be really straightforward if that property has been well taken care of. There may be kind of minor code things. I know we talk, like the common example we talk about a lot is smoke detectors, right? Like a lot of houses are going to have the smoke detectors where you put a 9-volt battery in it. And for an owner occupant, if an owner occupant chooses to do that, they choose to do that. I know in the rental code in one of the communities where I invest, we have to upgrade those to those 10-year sealed lithium smoke detectors. So we're taking all the smoke detectors down. We're putting up all new smoke detectors. So even just little things like that, in order to get the rental certificate, may be a requirement, plus additional fees and things like that fall into that as well.
Yeah, point of sale inspections are big here locally in a couple of the communities that I invest in, and they can be a huge part of the holding costs, actually. So we just bought a property that needs a fair bit of work actually done to it. And the city came in and actually inspected that and said, okay, well, that's fine, but you need to put X amount of dollars in escrow to cover these repairs. And they actually charged 150% of the estimated repair cost, and they get a whole lot of that money, and then I don't get it back until that stuff is done. So, the holding costs of that are far higher than you would have expected if you just done the work yourself. So those can really add up.
Yeah, we had one at one point where the handrail on the deck was a few inches too low, and in the code compliance, we had to remove the rails and we had to add new rails that were of the appropriate height or adjusted somehow. I can't remember how we did it, but I just remember that being an issue where we had to take care of that. I think one other thing on the list, we haven't talked about short-term rentals recently, but I know short-term rentals are very popular, especially as people are looking towards summer and looking to go to one themselves, right? As we look to summer vacations for those of us that live in the cold winter area. So the short-term rentals may have zoning requirements as well, where certain areas may not be really friendly for those, nightly or weekly rentals. Others that may be fine, but looking into a lot of those local issues as well. So you don't buy a property thinking that you can rent it on a short term and then finding out that that's not an option. So with that, loan considerations. Nate, what can you tell us about loans and how that plays into unexpected or unanticipated costs?
Yeah, so definitely an important one. And I think one that we don't talk about a lot because most people look at their fixed rate mortgages, which most people have on most of their properties, and think, well, that's the one thing that's not going to change, right? My principal and interest is locked in. But we are starting to see more and more investors using adjustable rate mortgages or mortgages that have a balloon payment at some point, especially once you get beyond that 10 loan limit for conventional loans that most people have on personal property acquisition. As soon as you're in the commercial space, you're going to see balloon payments. You're going to see adjustable rate mortgages. And as interest rates begin to rise, as I think we're going to start to see over the next year, especially, those adjustable rate mortgages start to really have an effect. And if you're not refinancing out of those, or you're not, doing things to change that interest rate in some capacity, you're going to see those costs go up. And so you really need to plan carefully, understand what your cap rates are for how those adjustable rate mortgages can increase or decrease and what that looks like. Because again, just in this market, in this where we are today, we are buying at the bottom, friends. Like if you're getting an adjustable rate mortgage today, it's probably not going down. So planning for that in advance, especially if you're in that commercial loan space or beyond that 10 loan limit, it becomes essential.
Yeah, I think the risk of a mortgage rate adjusting in the wrong way, which is an adjustable rate mortgage, where after 5 or 7 or 3 years or however that's set up in that specific loan product, that rate can adjust by a certain amount on an annual or whatever basis. Obviously, you need to read the terms of that to figure out how that works. Can you define for us real fast a balloon loan and what that would mean and what would be particularly scary about that too?
Yeah. So a balloon loan, the idea is that, and there's a lot of different ways you can structure this, but basically at some point in the life of that loan, you're going to owe a large amount. Basically, the rest of the loan is pretty typical. So you might be paying a 10-year mortgage that is amortized over 30 years, meaning you're making payments as if it were a 30-year mortgage, but at year 10, you owe whatever's left in a big due on sale clause, basically, even though you're not selling it. And if you don't refinance out of that, or you don't have the money to come up with, that all of a sudden that money is due whether you have it or not. And so you really need to be able to plan accordingly. And again, if your thought is, well, I'll just refinance and I'll fix that later, but rates have gone up dramatically, now all of a sudden you're stuck, right? You either sell that property and pay off that balloon payment, or you refinance and now have a higher interest rate to deal with. So yeah, I think we're going to see more of those loans as typical, and being able to plan ahead for those is super important.
Yeah. So if you take that on, knowing not only that you may have to refinance at a higher rate, but also that second refinance will have additional costs and is one more just kind of unexpected cost.
Well, David, why don't you talk to us then about repair contingencies?
Yeah, repair contingencies. It seems like right now most people are aware that labor cost is going up and material cost is going up. So I think that's a good place to start. If you had a roof replaced on your own house 5 or 10 years ago, and you're assuming that 5 or 10 years from now, the roof replacement will be about the same, I think that's probably not the safest assumption you could make right now with all those costs going up, knowing that if you're planning for future expenses, those future expenses may be more costly than whatever they would be today. So knowing that repairs happen and having that set aside, I think is really, really important, looking at these just kind of climbing costs.
And the tricky thing with repairs is that it's never consistent, right? You might set aside X amount of dollars every single month and not touch that pot of money for 6 months. Then all of a sudden you've got 3 things that break all on the same day. In fact, just last week, I had 2 things on one property go wrong in the exact same day. A tree branch fell on some power lines, which luckily wasn't my problem. And then within hours, the basement sink started spraying water all over the place, and I had to send a plumber out to this place. So it's just again, when it rains, it pours, and you've got to be able to account for that. And that contingency budget is super important to handling those things.
Yeah. And I think one other thing that can go into that is if you're ever planning some sort of rehab on a property after purchase, I think the same kind of things. You may have an idea of what those repairs might cost, but then there's always unexpected things like the basement sink, or it could be the water heater goes out and you were hoping it was going to last a little longer, or you get a bid back on something and it just comes up higher than you thought, or you start peeling something back and you realize the problem is bigger than you expected. So I think that those setting aside some additional repair contingency may be wise, because as costs keep going up and as unexpected things just do happen, it's easy to forget to plan for those things and easy to forget about those additional expenses. So Nate, also with your realtor hat on, tell me about shifting market conditions. The market has been on fire for the last few years, skyrocketing up. Is that something we can bet on for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, let me get my crystal ball off the shelf.
Yeah.
If I knew, right, I would be doing whatever I was predicting. But I do think I'm getting increasingly more nervous about how frothy the market is, right? I think that we're going to start to see it settle. But at the same time, there's still all this demand. And so it's impossible to know what the next 6 to 12 months looks like, or even beyond that. But again, I think with how hot the market has been, a lot of investors were taking on riskier deals, knowing that they could flip that property, and honestly holding it for an extra month helped them in almost every case, right? It was just waiting was never a bad thing. So I think that is going to start to go away. I think we're going to see a slight reversal in terms of how that housing market looks. But again, when that takes place is impossible to say. And how dramatic it's going to be is going to be impossible to say. And so just knowing that that's a piece, accounting for that today is really going to help make sure that you don't get burned later down.
Yeah, I think one way, if you're trying to mitigate that risk a little bit, would be thinking through the type of project that you're going to take on. If you're trying to walk into the market right now and buy a house that is just absolutely trashed, and it's going to take you 6, 7, 8 months to get that place fixed up, that feels riskier in this market if we're not convinced that values are going to stay up. Personally, I like those really quick kind of projects right now because it feels like it beats that risk a little bit of even just from the repair contingency we talked about a minute ago. If the scope of repairs is not all that significant, then there's fewer things that can go wrong there. And then if you're in it for a shorter period of time, those shifting market conditions are hopefully not as problematic.
Yeah, and I also recommend being a little more judicious in your property analysis, right? So if previously you were targeting $100 a month in cash flow and that was worth it because you were going to bank on appreciation, maybe bump those numbers a little bit. Give yourself more padding with cash flow. Don't trust appreciation as much as we've been seeing, and certainly not as much as we've seen in the last 2 years. I don't think that's repeatable. But again, maybe I'll check in next year and I'll be like, hey guys, I was wrong again. Who knows? So it's hard to predict, but that's what I'm forecasting anyway. All right, David, take us to number 7. We've gone through 6 already. We got the last one here, property taxes.
Yeah, just like shifting market conditions is a complete unknown, or anything that we're doing there is guessing. Like, one constant here is we know that there will always be property taxes, right? So it's always safe to know that that is there. You can bet on that, and that those property taxes, in many cases after the purchase of a property, may go up. And so if you're looking at your Zillow app or something like that, and you're looking at what are historical taxes, and you're assuming that that's going to always be the case for that property, that may not be a safe bet. And a lot of this is community specific, right? So there may be communities out there where it is safe, and I don't know, some permutation of something where the tax could drop, I would imagine somewhere. But I know, at least in the market where I invest, it's very common for those to go up. It's very common for those to continue to go up on an annual basis. And even in some cases, if you buy from an owner occupant and convert it to a rental, you may see a big jump. Or if you buy a property that has been owned by someone for a really long time, and the property tax have been kind of stable for that prior owner, and then you jump in, you can also see big jumps there as well. So what are you seeing in your market as far as property taxes?
Yeah, I mean, we saw quite a bit of relief in our local market. We had a really nice COVID tax bill come through, and that helped to reduce a lot of property taxes, or a lot of property tax growth year over year. So even though assessed values were going up dramatically because the market was increasing, there was a great COVID relief bill that came in that kept property taxes a little more in check. So basically, as people are living there and values are going up, they're not being overly taxed for not moving, right? So that helped our market quite a bit. But again, like you said, it pretty much always marches up. You're going to keep seeing that number increase as property values increase.
Yeah, one of the nice things is these things do get really market specific, like having a good realtor on your side that can point you in the right direction of how to estimate those. For instance, one community where we do some investing, they have a county website where you can go in and you can type in the value of the property and, whether it's going to be owner occupied or not. And you can get a very good estimate on what those property taxes will jump to. So you can have a little bit of better forward planning there. So leveraging those tools can be really helpful. Like, we looked at a property a little bit ago that looked like it was going to have pretty good cash flow until we did the math and saw that property taxes, based on all kinds of kind of unusual circumstances, were going to jump $600 a month if we bought that property. And so that was going to completely wipe out our cash flow. And then I'm paying monthly for the tenants to live there, and that felt like not a very good investment anymore. So those it feels like an unexpected expense or a easy to overlook expense. And so it's one more thing just to check with your realtor and check with your local taxing authority to make sure that you have that number estimated correctly.
And David, a good reminder that if you are in the market for a good real estate agent, especially one that is investor friendly and going to be able to speak to things like this, definitely head over to yfprealestate.com. We have a great way for you to get connected with me. We can do a 30-minute planning call, talk about what your goals are, get you connected with a local real estate investor friendly agent that's going to help you get off the ground and running. So if you need somebody local, no matter where you are in the country, even out of the country, we've helped people in Canada, which is pretty fun. So if you're even out of state or out of country, please let us know. We'd love to help with that. Get you connected with an awesome real estate investor friendly agent for completely free. So yfprealestate.com to get more information about that. So David, a lot that we've talked through, a lot of things to consider. So should everybody be terrified at this point? We have a lot of hidden costs we've talked about.
Yeah, I hope with this, again, because we're after that education and inspiration, I hope that this isn't just a scary thing. I hope that this is a list of things that could be reasonably planned for. And if you're thinking through things like this, if you've got professionals on your side that are helping you with the costs, that you've talked with an insurance agent, you've talked to the realtor, you've talked with all these people, they're getting you pretty good numbers, they're helping to make sure that you're not missing things like this. Hopefully with that reasonable planning, you can have a much more intelligent path forward, and some of these easily overlooked expenses won't be overlooked for you.
Yeah, David, you and I both bought properties this year here in 2022. So it's not like we're stopping, right? These are not things that are putting us in any sort of braking mode. We're just using it as extra reason to really be cautious and be smart about how we do this. Again, this is not a get rich quick scheme. This is a long game. And if you play it right, you can do it well. So that's how we approach all of that. So, make sure that you're taking into things like the seasonal demand, like we talked about, the tenant turnover that we talked about, property taxes, regulatory features. I mean, all the things on those lists are things that are going to help you as 2022 goes on.
Yeah, and it's super easy to walk into a house that you're thinking about buying as an investment property and just to fall in love with it. Be like, this would be so cool. Like I could see this and like this kitchen could be great. And like it's easy to have that just like emotional attachment to a house. Like I'm sure you've seen that as a realtor walking a house with a potential buyer. Like it's so easy to find that emotional attachment and then to start like just kind of cheating that math a little bit. Like, well, this place probably won't have too many repairs. I can move that. And so like it's easy to overlook these things and kind of trick yourself into that, but the math is the math, right? Like that's one thing that I think pharmacists can lock onto is the math is the math. And if you can just be very conscious about calculating these things in, then that can be one way to help keep yourself out of trouble over time.
You're giving me flashbacks to when I texted you earlier today about adding a sauna to one of my rentals because we found an extra shower. And I was like, we don't need this extra shower. Let's convert it to a sauna, right? No, bad idea. Anyway, the math, like you said, is super important. And I think if you're ever considering, hey, I don't know how to run this math or I want someone to double check my numbers, definitely a good chance to jump into the YFP REI Facebook group. Awesome community of pharmacists just like yourselves that are in real estate investing, learning about real estate investing, want to talk about it. Awesome place to drop information and questions. We've had really good responses on the stuff that comes up there. So if you've not already joined, find the YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group and become a member.
Yeah, I think it's a great spot for even very specific questions too. Like it's always hard to say like, is this house a good deal? Because people define deals so very differently, but it would be a great way to jump in and say, hey, this is what I'm finding for appliances. Does this sound reasonable? Or I got a quote for this for a kitchen. Here's a picture of the before kitchen and what we're looking at. Does that sound reasonable? Or any tips and tricks on how to keep these expenses down? Lots of great experienced investors in that community can help with some of those kind of questions.
Yeah, I love it. And I've got a major rehab that's just getting underway. So I might be throwing some design choices at the group and seeing if we can crowdsource the information to rehab my next property. So it should be fun.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Well, I hope that helps. Again, quick rundown. We've done 7 things that are hidden costs that you should be aware of. Number 1, tenant turnover. 2, seasonal demand. 3, local regulatory or zoning considerations. 4, adjustable rate or balloon loans. 5, repair contingencies. 6, shifting market conditions, and 7, property tax changes. So hopefully it gives you guys an extra thing to think about as you're purchasing investment properties here in 2022 and beyond. So have a great rest of the day, everybody, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.